Warbles on a lot to YouTube, particularly htomerif. Now last night I put up a 1 minute 20-second movie showing how I fill the car, I write down the fuel Bowser figures, I explained that the Bowser is certified by the Board of Weights and Measures to be accurate to 0.1%, and the RTA scrutinises the cars before they let them get registered, and the odometers are accurate to some reasonable proportion. It's probably not 0.1%, you know, the speedometers in the police cars are probably that accurate, but for my figures, pretty good, you know. So, yes, I write the figures in the book. And what we get is this 26.03 litres of fuel led to this 250 kilometres. This 13.04 litres led to this 122.3. This 6.51 litres led to 1.4 plus 31.9 kilometres. The extra 1.4 was because the nut behind the wheel forgot to zero the trip meter until he was 1.4 k's up the road. Yeah? Worked it out with the odometer readings. So, this 6.25 litres drove that 73.6 kilometres, 13.22, 144.3, 13.43, 104.5, 13.21, 143.8, 13.51, 123 point nothing, 13.12, 141, 13.15, 40.2, 19.78, 266.7. Got the idea? Of course, there is a reserve amount of fuel in the tank. It's about 5 litres. Pretty sure of that. And when the needle on the fuel gauge touches the red reserve line, it means that you got 5 litres in the tank, and there's two intersecting reasons why you really need, or I really need, to put more fuel in the car at that point. 5 litres at 10 k's to the litre, or 10.2 or 2.9 as I'm getting at the moment, means I should be able to go from town out to here, which is 15 k's, and back to town, which is another 15 k's. But if you got less than 5 litres in the tank, your empty tank evaporation rate starts to climb. If you've got more than 5 litres, you're only losing 100 mils a day. If you've got less than 5 litres, you're losing about 200 mils a day. If you've got less than 2.5 litres, you probably start losing 300 mils a day. What I do know is that if I burn 5 litres in 3 days, I get lucky to get 10 k's to the litre. If I burn 5 litres in 1 day, I get 13 k's to the litre. That's done with empty tank to empty tank recordings. It's a pain in the arse. You run out of fuel on the side of the road, fill up from a jerry can, and then drive straight to the service station. So that is my method. I top up, or I add some fuel. I don't actually top the tank up, I just add some fuel when it's nearly empty, right? And I use a long baseline to establish an accurate fuel burn figure. I get monthly figures because I can trust them. It's what really happened. It's how far I went in the month, and it's how much fuel I burned. And if there's 4 litres in the tank at the start of the month, and there's 4.5 litres in the tank at the end of the month, it really doesn't make a whole lot of difference when you're talking about 700 kilometres and maybe 68 litres or something, right? It's as near as damn is to swearing the most accurate functional method of doing fuel burn measurements, I think. However, that's not how my son does it. And this is the project report from when he got his Brumby hooked up with a solar panel. And whereas I'm an empty tank topper-upperer, my son is a fillet to the top man, okay? So what he does is he writes down how much fuel he's used, 21.00 litres, for 136.4 kilometres, 3rd of the 7th 09. 28.69 litres, 205.8. See there it says no alt on vehicle, 19th of the 7th 09. This is the typed up version of that. 21 litres for 136 kilometres, 3rd of the 7th. 6.49 kilometres to the litre, driving around town in Glen Innes, car not garaged at night. Alright, now look at the date. Okay, July, coldest month in Glen Innes. So he's been getting up at Sparrow Fart, starting the engine, letting it idle with the choke on, alternator at low revs, high output, running the heater fan to try and demist the windscreen. 28.69 litres for 208 kilometres, 19th of the 7th, 09. 7.26 kilometres to the litre. Now, why was it so much better? Well, on the 14th of the 7th, the rotor on his alternator died, and the Brumby drove to and from work without any alternator for 4 consecutive days. Right? He put a different alternator in, 13.33 litres for 48.5 kilometres. 3.63 kilometres to the litre. Now, in brackets, after 4 days without the alternator, the battery was seriously discharged. Right? So this shows 10 days of lead-acid parachute effect. Right? Do you understand what I just said? The 20-watt solar panel was feeding the battery as hard as it could for 4 days when there was no alternator in the vehicle. Right? He didn't do a lot of driving, but he did 4 days worth of going to work and going to collect smoko and going home at the end of the day with the headlights on, because it's winter time and he didn't knock off till after 5 o'clock. And the solar panel and the battery were able to keep the vehicle operating. However, the battery was getting more and more progressively discharged, so that when he did put the alternator on, the alternator was then at just about full output. And driving around town, he went from, well, 6.49 kilometres to the litre before the alternator blew up, to 3.63 kilometres to the litre when the new alternator was trying to kiss and make up to the battery, which had been seriously discharged. Okay? Now let's have a look at that graphically. Okay, now here's the other advantage of his method, is he's able to give me 3 different kinds of fuel consumption figures. The unbroken line is on the highway, driving between Glen Innes and Tamworth for his apprentice lectures. Alright? Now, before we put the solar panel on the car, his highway fuel burn was 11.33 kilometres to the litre in the Brumby. Now, these differences is whether he's going up the hill or down the hill. Right? But by November, from June, 14.71 kilometres to the litre on the highway. Now I'll tell you why that was such a good trip for him. He nearly hit a kangaroo, frightened him, right? So he drove the rest of the trip to Tamworth really slowly. This was the trip coming back up the hill afterwards, right? These are sort of spot point figures. But you can basically say that going to Tamworth, going to Tamworth, going to Tamworth, going to Tamworth, going to Tamworth. Yeah, his car was running a lot better on the highway with a solar panel as well as the alternator. The dotty lines, that's in Glen Innes. Alright? That's the difference between driving around the town, having no alternator, having the alternator working flat out to try and kiss and make up to the battery. Afterwards, you've basically got this steady progression. I think what's going on here is he's starting to get a little bit lead-footed around the town. The dashed lines, that's driving around in Tamworth city traffic. Okay, dump, 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 fit the solar panel, zzz, driving in city traffic. Okay, so it definitely makes a bigger difference in town than it does on the highway. If you want to look at fuel consumption, instead of kilometres to the litre, which is the efficiency figure, let's look at litres per 100 kilometres. So he's gone from in town, driving around at sort of 15 litres per 100 kilometre, when his alternator is kissing and making up to the battery after 4 days of not having an alternator, we're up around 30 litres per 100 kilometres driving around the town. Right? But once again, he's litres per 100 kilometre driving in town comes down to there. Right? It's not really difficult to understand, I don't think. But then I am the fool on the hill. You know, a mad scientist. I can spend days figuring out how to draw those graphs. I'm showing it to you in a couple of minutes and I'm assuming that you're going to understand it. I don't know whether you will. Maybe it's too difficult. But when you tell me you reckon my fuel burn distance figures are wishful thinking, you're trying to tell me that my son is a bullshit artist, or he's too stupid to be able to write down a fuel Bowser figure, and that's what you're implying about me too. You think it can't be possible, therefore I have to be a liar or a nut. And that's bloody insulting, mate. I mean, I'm a neurotic, I'm not a psychotic. Neurotics worry about stuff. Psychotics are out of touch with reality. People who light a fire to make their food become cold are out of touch with reality. They are psychotics. Right? I don't own a fridge. I get a pension for worrying about stuff that the psychotics don't care about. And this is one of the things that the psychotics don't care about. They are out of touch with the reality of how much of their fuel burn is being wasted kissing and making up to their fucking battery. Now that's the fuel gauge in question. When the needle touches the top of that red line, I've got 5 litres in the tank. If the needle is anywhere on the red line and I'm out here, I've got enough fuel to get to town. If the needle does not come up to touch the red line when the engine runs, then I'm going to get stuck halfway to town, right? Now let's do a little bit of a cloudy day demonstration. There's the cloud in front of the sun. There's the regulator saying the battery's fully charged. I'm now about to start the engine. I want you to watch the light show. Accessories on. No drama. Just turn the radio on. Okay?
I don't know. It just seemed like...
So there's not actually enough sunlight to run the radio. However, now I'm running at 1000 RPM and it will idle. There it's idling at about 600 RPM. Alright? Now this is too slow for the alternator to do anything. I'm going to give it some throttle now. That's the 1000, 1500, 2000. Now the alternator is definitely doing what it wants to. The battery's up around 13.5 to 13.8, I think. And now idling at about 800 RPM, so the alternator's doing 1600, so it's fast enough to run its own exciter circuit, but it's not putting out much current. Now what we're doing now is just waiting to see how long it takes. And there's clouds moving away from the sun. So the solar power, there we go. Big go. Right, so there's just barely enough juice for the alternator to run its exciter circuit. We turn the radio on.
He'd become friends with a wandering soul, the spirit of an American officer. The ghost was very educated.
What's this? This is parking lights. Right? Parking lights on, parking lights off. Right? But we're running the radio, the fuel pump, the coil, all on sunlight. Now watch this, I'm going to flip the headlights on. Right? The alternator cannot handle the headlights at 500 RPM. It's trying very hard. Headlights off. We're back up to about 13.3, 13.4 volts there. And the regulator's back on fully charged. I hope that clears it up for you. Ciao.